So I'm going to make a minestrone soup for you today. I think a minestrone soup is one of my favorite, what I would call my hearty soups. When I say I want a hearty soup this week, it means I just want everything in a bowl. I want some protein, I want some starch, I want some vegetables, I want it to be warm and filling and comforting and tasty. So minestrone it is. And I'm going to start like I start so many soups, onions, carrots, and celery, but in this case, I'm going to use a leek. And I didn't stop and show you how I was cutting that leek up, but I hope you saw that I peeled off the outside and then I cut down lengthwise in 2 directions, and then I just, put it all together. So I'm going to take you all the way through this minestrone. That's my plan. Because I'll tell you what I like about minestrone. I can put a lot of vegetables in it. It's a very flexible recipe. It's a no recipe. So olive oil in there. And there's a lot of opportunities for you to do things like use some of your cheats, your kitchen cheats. So this can be a super duper homemade piece of art. And it can be done with a lot of pantry items and shortcut items. So first, that was a little too hot for my leeks. I heat up my oil, and then I put in my leeks, and I get some salt. All right, let's get that going. Now remember, start this right out. I am going to use broth in here that is not salted. You can use salted broth, but if you do, you're not going to want to add as much salt as I am. I just put in probably 1/4 teaspoon of salt on my leeks. And every time I add a few more vegetables, I'm going to add a little bit more salt. And that's because water follows salt. I want these vegetables to break down. Give the celery a rinse. I want these vegetables to break down and be soft, so they'll release their juices and all their flavors into the broth of the soup if I salt them. So this is the last of a celery packet, so I'm just cutting down lengthwise. So my hearty soup, this is where you get to decide, do I want the vegetables cut up small, or do I want big, chunky, sort of rustic soup with big chunks in it? And I'm going to go with small with some of this stuff. My celery, I do like small pieces because to me, celery provides nutrients and flavor, but I don't want big chunks of celery in my soup. It's a personal preference. And if this was an onion, I would want to saute that onion for about another 5 minutes by itself first. But leeks don't take as long to cook, so I'm going to add my celery and carrots right on top of it. And I'll put a little bit of salt on that once I get the carrots. Now, let's see. I want to draw your attention to the knife that I'm using. So oftentimes, when you see someone using a chef's knife, they'll use a knife like this. And I like this knife a lot. This is like a Chicago cutlery. It's an all right knife. I have another one that I like a little better. But knives are really personal. And the knife you use needs to be really comfortable for you. So I see a lot of people, usually women, usually older women, and they'll be using very small knives to do all their work. And it seems to me that that's not very efficient because sometimes a bigger knife is better. But I think what that shows is, women, we have smaller hands, and we want a knife that, fits our hand and isn't too heavy for us. And sometimes those chef's knives, those 9-inch chef's knives, might be too much for some people's hands. And I love, this was the first good knife I bought myself. And I bought it in graduate school when I was at Bastyr because part of our coursework for our nutrition degree was whole foods production with my teacher and beloved mentor, Cynthia Lair, whose cookbooks I always recommend to you guys, and her great videos. And for that class, we had to buy, this was, like a textbook. We had to buy a cookbook, and we had to buy this knife, and we had to buy an apron. And I remember thinking, oh, why do I have to buy another knife? And I was so glad I did. This is a Japanese knife, and these Japanese knives, it doesn't have a pointed tip, but you can get these with a pointed tip, and that can be useful. But it's super light. It's a really lightweight, and the blade is very thin, which it makes it easy and quick to sharpen. It's much easier to sharpen this one than it is my big chef's knives. And because the blade is thin, it can be easier for cutting up things like carrots. So it's a great veg prep knife. It is probably the best knife I have for prepping all kinds of vegetables because it's light and it's easy to use. So it says Caddy. I think if I wipe it off, you can see it says Caddy right there. And that, I never, I want to say that's probably like a $30-something knife. You can get, of course you can spend the earth on knives, but I really think you can get a very good knife for under $40. And the trick then is just to take care of it. And when it gets dull, which they will when you use them, you make sure you sharpen them or take them in to be sharpened. And I sharpen mine at least twice a year. My mom and I have what brand? We have one of these electric knife sharpener things that we share it. So I'll bring it over to my house and sharpen my knives and sometimes sharpen hers. And in between I hone. Anyways, you see what I'm doing. I'm going to put a lot of carrots. So onions, carrots, celery. That's the base of this soup and so many soups that I do. Onions, carrots, and celery. So you're building up a lot of, phytonutrients, those plant chemicals, bioflavonoids, a lot of fiber. They say eat your vegetables. Don't ever discount all the onions and carrots and celery that you put into a soup. And there's some people, kids especially, who really like soup, and it's easy to digest, because some people with weak digestions, when they eat salads and things, they just poop vegetable bits. They don't digest them. And especially in the wintertime, cooking your vegetables is a great way to make them easier to digest. So I'm going to get my salt back out, put another about quarter teaspoon or so on my carrots and celery and stir those up. All right, let's let that soften, and I'll get all the other ingredients ready to use. So when you're planning your meal, we just had a late lunch. It's gone, what time is it? We had a really late lunch today. So I'm making my dinner now, which is often when I'll start my dinner, is when I'm in the kitchen clearing up for lunch or making my lunch. I'll start it, and then I can go and work or do something else, and then dinner is ready. So a lot of what I do for this soup is going to be simmering for a while, and then the vegetables that take less time to cook, I'll put in during the last 10 minutes of cooking, just before we eat. You know what I mean? So onions, carrots, and celery, those are going to go for a while, and then the leaves like kale and cabbage, those will go in later. So I'm going to talk you through those. First, I'm going to add one of my favorite herb blends, Herbs de Provence, Provence. That mixture of basil, thyme, oregano, lavender. You can put some thyme in here and some oregano. You can just put a mix of those things. If you do use rosemary, there's rosemary in here. Remember, rosemary is a flavor bully. It really can overpower a dish. So if you do add dried rosemary to this, go easy on it. It looks like there's quite a bit of rosemary in here, but it works. The balance of herbs in here is really good. You can get this. I can get this online, sometimes in the bulk food section, or you can buy it from my friend Erin Harwood at Garden Delights, where they grow all these herbs at their farm here in Clark County, and then have freshly dried blends to sell for you to buy. So you get fresh herbs every year, which is great. All right, so I want that to soften, and while that's going, let's prep and talk about all the other stuff that goes in. Where's my garlic? Where's my garlic? So the minestrone really can be a kitchen sink for a lot of vegetables. And I think it's best with garden vegetables But I'll tell you what I don't put in my minestrone. I don't put peppers, ever. That really can overpower your minestrone, I think. And I don't put broccoli or cauliflower. Maybe you could, but it's just not a traditional thing to put in your minestrone. Think of Italy, and I don't put aubergines or eggplants. That's also something I don't put in. So in addition to these, I would put in, like, late summer is the best time to make minestrone because green beans are awesome in here. Summer squash, like yellow squash and zucchini, are very good in here. Kale, Swiss chard, cabbage, all those kind of vegetables. And then it's always in a tomato base. So I'm going to show you what I've done in preparation for this because you might know that minestrone is typically a meat and bean combo. So that's always my ideal protein combination is I want to get a little bit of animal protein and some plant protein, sometimes in the same dish, sometimes on different days. So in this dish, I will often, for my meat, to make a really big pot of hearty soup, I will brown a pound of ground beef ahead of doing these vegetables, set it aside, and then add it back in once I have everything in the soup. But what I did this time is I made beef broth from beef bones a few days ago and strained it out and chilled the broth. And I saved the meat because a lot of these bones were like vertebra. I think actually these might have been oxtail bones. So this was all the meat from the soup bones that I picked off. And that's going to be the meat for this. And that'll go in last. That just needs to be heated through. And beans are going to be cannellini beans. Now you can use other beans if you like. You might prefer to use kidney beans or I don't know, whatever kind of beans. I love cannellini beans because I think they have that nice creamy texture. And now this is where you can split. And do you want to go all homemade? I did cooking from scratch here because, I have them. It's so much cheaper to use dried beans and healthier because, as you know, I always cook my beans with a little bit of kombu or sea kelp. But again, if this is a pantry thing, you're a grown-up, so you always have canned beans in the cupboard. And I'm going to show you what I want you to get if you have a choice. Yeah, see, I keep cannellini beans in the cupboard. And there's a lot of different brands, but you know how I buy them? I look at the ingredients. Can you see? Ingredients, organic. What is it? White kidney beans, water, and kombu seaweed. So I like a couple of things about this. Yeah, it's nice to have organic beans. They use kombu to cook their beans too, which makes them taste better, improves their nutrition. But these beans aren't cheap, and you can get them from other places. Remember, a lot of times there's salt in here. Nothing wrong with salt, but you need to factor that into your cooking. So if you don't want the added salt, remember you can always strain your beans in a colander and rinse them off first. Okay? Or you can use the salt, but just be smart with it. Okay. So now I'm going to get my other vegetables ready for this, and I'll talk to you about the soup broth. Going for my garlic now. Just going to do a rough cut of my garlic. I don't want that to go in right now because I know you read about this all the time. You'll read. Excuse me. Saute your onions and garlic until onions are soft, and then add blah, 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 blah. No, don't do that. If you saute your garlic with your onions, your garlic will burn. Garlic is an aromatic, and it has lots of natural sugars in it, and they burn. So that garlic is getting set aside. And then you know what I love in my minestrone is I love shredded cabbage. It's good in it, and it gives a little bit of extra texture. So I bought this. I didn't have any cabbage left in my garden. So I'm just going to peel out the outer leaves of this. And then you could shred this if you want to, on your box grater or on your food processor. but I don't need this quite as thin as I would for coleslaw. But you can put in quite a bit of cabbage in here. And do you know that cabbage is really rich in vitamin C? It's really rich in vitamin C. In fact, any green leaf is very high in vitamin C, and the fresher the better. There you go. And I'm just going to set all these last minute additions aside in a bowl so that when I'm done here, I can just tidy up after myself. That would be good of me. And then I can set a timer to come back, you know, half an hour or so before we eat and just add these in. All right. And then I'm going to talk to you about the broth, so hang with me. I have some kale, and I like the wrinkly kale, but you can use any type of kale. I'm going to add this, and I tend to like kale, so you could, for your greens, you could also use a Swiss chard. I do not like spinach in this because spinach gives it that funny spinachy taste. I often use Swiss chard because it grows so well in my garden, and I always get volunteers from the last year's Swiss chard. But let me tell you why I often prefer kale. Kale is lower in histamines and oxalates than spinach and Swiss chard, and a lot of my clients who I work with are trying to minimize those things. So it doesn't mean you can't have Swiss chard, but mix it up. Same with spinach. Too much spinach is just too many histamines, too many oxalates. I know it's convenient because it's sold all small and washed. So I want my kale all done in small pieces. So I'm gonna, do you see what I'm doing? Kind of bunching it together and rolling it up. It's not quite gonna be a chiffonade because these aren't laying flat. But I did kind of roll it. What I'm trying to do is roll it up into like a cigar shape and then cut it crossways. And that's how you do a chiffonade, to make ribbons of kale. But this is just a little awkward. I'm just going to keep piling this in. See, this is my bowl of things to add last. How's my soup going? All right, let's put this kale project on the back burner. Add garlic now. We've been building flavor, and let's shift gears and talk about the liquid that we're adding to this. Mostly the broth. So first, I'm going to add a quart of tomatoes. These are home canned tomatoes. Yours don't have to be. Again, you could be Susie Homemaker, grow your tomatoes and can them, or you can just buy canned tomatoes in the store. No problem at all with that. I think I'm just going to do 1 jar of tomatoes. I'm going to turn my heat up now. And then I'm going to add all of my beans. And I'm adding the bean cooking liquid too, because I cook this with kombu, and I want all that seaweed in my soup broth. Remember that kombu is so rich in glutamic acid, that it just gives it that wonderful umami flavor in that broth. It's so good, and it really improves the nutritional value of my soup. So always using kombu in my soup. Here's a fun shortcut. Do you know what this is? It's dried zucchini and summer squash. So you always have too much. You have no zucchini or you have too much zucchini. So I did zucchini and yellow squash, and I slice it up and put it in my food dehydrator, and then I can just, look, instant vegetables in my soup. Cool. So there's that. And then, if I have my choice, I want beef broth in my soup. But I just made beef broth, so a really concentrated beef broth here. But I want most of this for French onion soup. I love French onion soup, and that does require beef broth. So I'm going to use some of that, and I have just maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of a box of chicken broth. in my fridge, so I'm going to use that up because I don't want that to go off. That's not cheap. So a little bit of that. And then I'll use my beef broth. Oh, yum, yum. Now, here's something. If you're not familiar with making broth, when you make chicken or beef or pork broth, you always, cook it and then you strain everything out so you just have the liquid and then you chill it. And when you chill it, the fat floats to the top. You see that layer of white rendered out fat? Now you can choose to throw this out or you can use it. And you can use this to cook with. Look at that. Oh, cool. I'm going to scrape off the meat jello underneath. You can cook with this fat. It is cold outside and I have chicken. I'm going to give it to my chickens. And then I'm going to just scrape out some of this broth into here. And I know it's really concentrated, so that's good. And the rest of this, I'm going to divide this into probably 3 or 4 containers and put it in the freezer and date it so that I have enough for a couple of different batches of onion soup or whatever kind of soup I feel like making. Let's put a little bit more in there. Really concentrated. And I like a concentrated broth because it takes up less room in my freezer. All right. Turn that right up. Okay, so that is what I'm going to let cook. So the things that aren't in there are my greens for the end. If you have green beans, and I think I have some green beans frozen that I might or might not use, I would put maybe a cup or so of green beans. If it's in the middle of summer and I'm just up to my eyeballs in green beans, I would just put a shit ton of green beans in this soup. So I've got that. I've got my meat that can go in a little bit later. If I had browned a pound of ground beef, I would add that now. But this meat, I think, will just get super tough in there. So I'm going to wait until later and add that later. And I'm going to add a little more flavoring at the end. I have some frozen basil that I mixed up, and I have that in the fridge because I used half of it last night for a different soup. And I've got a little frozen basil. You could use fresh basil, or you could buy yourself a jar of pesto. And I think that fresh basil or pesto is a great addition to the end of your soup. So, and I know what you're going to ask me. What about the pasta? Is there pasta in this soup? Yes. And that goes in at the end too. So I'm going to tell you what goes in the end of this so I can do this all in one take. I'm going to set a timer, and about half an hour before I want to eat, maybe 45 minutes, I'm going to come back in the kitchen and I'm going to throw a few handfuls of pasta into this. Now, if you are gluten-free, you can do a couple of different things. One, you can skip that altogether and just have, this could be a super low carb soup for you. You could put a gluten-free pasta in here. Or you could cube up some potatoes and add some potatoes, and they could be the starch in there. And they're really good in a minestrone. And I would do smaller cubes. So it's just a different kind of soup. So you could put those in there. And then after those have been cooked, that's been cooking for about 10 minutes or so, then I would add all of my kale and cabbage, green beans, whatever I want to add there. And I'm going to add my meat then, just to heat through. And at the very last bit, then I'm going to add some basil, stir it up, make sure I have enough salt, and serve it with some Parmesan cheese and some nice crusty bread. So that is my minestrone, and I really hope you like this. I have, see if I remember, I have a written recipe for this. But the written recipe, like I said, this is a non-recipe recipe. You're going to make this minestrone with whatever ingredients you have, with what you like, and make it the right size. But if I could offer you one piece of advice, use your biggest pot, because no matter what you think you're going to make, it's always going to make more soup than you planned. And that's a good thing. All right. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy the soup.